Treasure the Titans takes an unusual twist on the turn-based tactical gameplay that I'm used to seeing. There are many components here that are incredibly interesting and entertaining to explore, but I also believe that there's a lot missing, or at the very least, a lot of things that detract from the overall experience due to an imbalance of events or just because of the linear approach to gameplay. While the gameplay itself is very engaging and exudes a lot of passion for those who are heavily invested in classic tactical turn-based games, I can't help but feel that it's just too linear throughout all of the difficulties, primarily because it feels like a campaign where you're completing different preset stages and on a series of randomized levels. This just makes it so much more easier to complete once you know exactly where all of the enemies spawn and what their main goals are by placing your units in the proper locations to get the most out of all of their abilities. This is where I believe the game might benefit from further developments to create a system that isn't overly predictable after a certain length of time. Because even if you do know the layout where everything spawns and where you can utilize your characters to block the entrances to each gate, it all basically boils down to the sheer random component of the distribution of stats and effects through the Tetris trash minigame. You'll get more pieces from the amount of trash that you rescue from the bandit rats, which are randomized for frustration rather than for your fun. I know it seems strange to say, but when you're practically unable to make real progress because of a coin flip for the correct upgrades and stat increases, it's just not fun, because the tactical portion comes from trying to struggle your way through many of the poor builds that you get. I would regularly lose entire runs not because the game was too difficult, but rather because you had no control over this mechanic. It is essentially a huge gamble for skills, stats, and effects. I've gone through an entire run without finding a single straight piece, a block, an L shape, or a reverse block, which effectively prevents you from connecting a long bonus to empower everybody. Each and every character has their own style. There's a warrior, a ranger, a necromancer, a tank, and even a rogue. And it's a lot of fun to mix and match your skills and combos together, especially when you can pull consecutive boons that increase the power of one in particular, where you might also see absolutely no upgrades for one of your other characters. One example would be obtaining the boons for Possum the Ranger, one of my favorite characters to play with. Specifically, her passive effect for slowing and poisoning at a safe distance with her ability that can ricochet up to 4 units at once. Acquiring the boon for Turret, which is a little baby possum that can be spawned multiple times, along with the boon that copies all of her effects onto them with an increased range, while getting lucky with the 50% less mana cost, plus use your skills again this turn, you can probably now see how ridiculously powerful a lot of these builds can eventually get, so long as you're lucky enough to get to that point earlier on. You'll frequently find yourself struggling because you have absolutely nothing you can call an ordered and well-developed build while battling a very long and drawn-out fight for no good reason. In terms of visuals, the game is gorgeously pixelated and it looks stunning and simplistic with its character and boss designs. To effectively combat each enemy, you must first understand your effects, which is as simple as hovering your mouse over them for such information. I feel like a lot of people undervalue a tactical game with very little in terms of tutorials, as they simply drop you in and leave you to your own devices. The only problem that I saw outside of all the randomization is that it did seem like if you ever did try to navigate characters without first rotating the map, you might find yourself accidentally clicking the wrong tile, which was absolutely frustrating, as on the higher difficulties, you do not have the ability to redo your moves like you do with the lower difficulties. The music here is very eerie and it does an excellent job of calming you down and making you feel more relaxed as you casually survey your surroundings and prepare for the counterplay. Playing on the higher difficulties doesn't really make anything more difficult, even with the shadow effect. All it really does is simply layer a blanket of mist that significantly reduces your field of vision while not really doing much in terms of changing anything outside of the original maps. And the things that they do change is simply making the enemies more stronger, having poison effects, and also splitting into slimes. I think the problem for me was I was anticipating a series of roguelike effects with randomly generated maps, rather than a linear campaign of combat that becomes increasingly easier to cope with as you learn the base game concept. Like, no matter what you do, the AI will always choose the less important target over the higher value targets, making it kind of cheesy to play around that specific element. It's like you ignoring a healer and focusing on the tank in any other game. I'm not trying to argue that it degrades the experience, I'm simply trying to say that it has a lot less replayability, since when you know exactly what's going to be happening in the current map you're in, you don't really have to think too much about how to respond, because all you will have to do at that point is just counter their spawns and take them out with very powerful or weak force builds that are what ultimately make each run good and bad. So if you played through it once and you got through it, your next run will basically be you doing the exact same thing, just planning for the next maps, and it's pretty smooth sailing.